In ministry context today, we can sometimes allow the complexity and busyness of the world around us, the needs of our community, and the small annoyances arising from differences in our perspectives and behaviors to stand in the way of truly coming together to see what God is doing in the midst of our church, our ministry, or our team. So I see three things happening in this context and three approaches that we can take to address it. I call this season a season of shaking. Why? Because things are being shaken all around us. Perspectives, values, beliefs. We are questioning things that we assumed or took for granted a couple of decades ago. The question in the midst of this shaking is to ask, what is biblical? As we navigate it as a church, as a ministry, or as a team, what is biblical? If we ask that question, we can first of all foster a conversation that helps us focus on what we do agree on and what we should agree on. It also helps us to see what are things that maybe aren't as critical or important as we thought that they were. Often what happens in a culture is that our culture informs the way that we practice our faith or live out our beliefs. That's not bad. That happens everywhere in the world and it has throughout history. But culture can start to overtake some of the core values and impose tradition or practices onto those values till we get to a point where we don't even know what's tradition and what is the truth. In a season of shaking and cultural upheaval like we're navigating right now, we have an opportunity to look at what are actually the values that we need to embrace and cling to, and what are some of the things that are just traditions. They're just part of our culture that have informed our beliefs, but they're not essential or core to our beliefs. I think in a season of shaking, what we have is an opportunity to really get back to the basics, to get back to the core of who we are, what we believe, and why we believe it, and to bring generations, both experienced as well as younger, together to really redefine those things and to think about how to live them out in a new cultural context. Another important consideration for us as we think about leadership in this current context is understanding different paradigms of leadership. General Stanley McChrystal, in his book of Team of Teams, presents an analogy that has really stuck with me. He says that traditionally we viewed leaders as chess masters, people who have experience and expertise and a lot of knowledge to be able to know what needs to happen as they look at the chessboard, right? What needs to happen in their organization or their team. They know the different members of that team and they call the shots, they make the moves that they see as being most effective or most necessary. However, in our current cultural context, with so much information coming at us and so much change occurring, it's almost impossible for one leader to have all the knowledge and expertise needed to navigate any particular context. So McChrystal proposes a new model of leadership, which he calls the gardener. The gardener doesn't even necessarily produce the fruit or the food in the garden. He simply produces the environment that the plants need to grow and to be fruitful. This means considering what type of soil is needed, how much sunlight, how much water to give to the plants so that they can grow and thrive. In this context, the gardener has a whole different set of responsibilities. I think this applies really effectively to ministry context. We often hear the term helicopter parenting, right? Where parents do a lot for their kids, and as a result, sometimes disempower their kids or disable their kids in some way from being able to reach their full potential or capacity. I think we also have some cases of helicopter pastoring in our culture today, where leaders of ministries or churches have done a lot for their people. And as a result, we see pastors and leaders often doing 80 or 90% of the work and trying to get their people mobilized to do more. But they never really probably will until we shift our approach of leadership to that of a gardener. Another thing that I think is really relevant as we think about ministry context today is a reminder of what the Bible says about the priesthood of all believers, that we are the body of believers, all with different gifts and parts. And this really fits into the model of the gardener effectively. Often, we have relied on those in vocational ministry roles to do a lot of the work of the church. But today in our society, fewer and fewer people will ever even walk through the doors of a church. We cannot wait for people to come into the church. We must empower the priesthood of believers. We must empower people to live out their faith and to use their gifts wherever they find themselves, in work, in their community, or in their homes. So I think that these are some ideas that we need to think about and embrace in our ministry context, and that I talk about more in my book. A season of shaking. What does a season of shaking produce as far as opportunities for us as we think about what we value, what we cling to? What traditions can we maybe let go of as we adopt new mindsets and methods that are consistent with what the Bible says? What kind of leadership mentality do we have? Do we view ourselves as a chess master, needing to call the shots and make all the decisions, and really relying on ourselves to do a lot of the work and maybe helicopter pastoring more than we should? Or do we embrace this view of a gardener, of leadership as being that of developing an environment and context where people can grow? And in doing so, what are we doing to equip and enable the priesthood of believers to be fully functional, not just inside the four walls of the church where they're running our weekly programs, but to truly be a priesthood of believers out in the community, in their homes, and in their workplaces where God has placed them for this season. I talk about these three concepts in more depth in the last three chapters of my book, A Daniel Generation.